Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we are going to be talking about the economics of golf. A lot of economics there, it turns out. So stick around. But yeah, first, we wanted to talk about China. And the data point there is 4, as in 4%. That is the estimated growth rate in China this year, which would be enviable for many Western countries. But in China's case, it represents a shortfall from the 5.5% growth that was expected just a few months ago.
For more than 2 decades, China's economy has been the dependable engine for global economic growth. But that engine is starting to splutter.
That's just one data point among others that suggests China may be in a recession right now.
The world's second largest economy is slowing.
Consumer confidence is hovering near record lows. Private investment slowed down in the first half of the year. And youth unemployment apparently is at a record 19% right now. So, yeah, anytime the world's second largest economy is in a recession, it seems like something worth thinking about. So, Adam, I guess I'd start out by asking, how I just mentioned a bunch of data coming from China, and I was curious how accurate the data from the Chinese government is about its own economy. I mean, how much would that impede our ability to tell whether the country's in a recession in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, when you have a situation where 4% growth is probably a recession, there's something odd about the numbers. They're not the same as the numbers that we use in the West, because in the West it would be 2 quarters of negative growth in GDP that would generally be seen as the definition of a recession. The Chinese numbers are different. I mean, I think it's important to clarify, though, that we don't generally, I think, spend a lot of time worrying about outright statistical fraud. So political authorities in Beijing dictating that the inflation number should be X when it's actually Y. But numbers like GDP are question begging to an extent, right? But in every circumstance, GDP is a very complex notion. Gross domestic product is the aggregate of total production of services and goods throughout the economy, and it is adjusted for value added, it is adjusted for prices. It's a very complex notion under the best circumstances, and the fundamental issue with the GDP numbers in China is it's not obvious whether those statistics are, if you like, sort of ex post external assessments of what's happening, or more like performance targets and policy instruments. In other words, Beijing says growth should be 4%, and so then the regional authorities across China bend every effort towards delivering that, right? So it's more like a kind of corporate target than a GDP measurement in the sense that we're familiar with in the West. I mean, so disconcerting, so unstable is our confidence in the GDP numbers in China, in particular, that there's a whole batch of different measurements, including satellite measurements of factory activity and transport measures and so on, that are commonly used as substitutes for GDP. And if you take a broader measure of China's situation right now, there's really no doubt that the Chinese economy is in serious trouble, probably the most serious bout of weakness it's seen since the beginning of the reform period in the 1980s. And so many indicators point in that direction right now. And so, willing is Beijing to acknowledge the fact that it is in trouble, that a truly fake number, would just stand out like a sore thumb. It wouldn't be an effective way of committing a statistical fraud, because it would be so obviously out of line with everything else that's going on. And there's too much money at stake in investments in China for not a huge amount of attention not to be paid to the details of these figures. So complexity, opacity, ambiguity in what the numbers mean, rather than outright fraud, I think is the name of the game in China.
Gotcha. Okay. Regardless of what the precise numbers are, it does seem clear that at the center of China's economic problems are a bursting real estate bubble in essence. And yeah, that got me wondering, how did this bubble inflate in the first place? And then also to look at the response to this bursting bubble, it seems like China has been lowering interest rates. And I was curious, yeah, what are the risks of doing that at a moment like this in the rest of the world where we see other countries essentially universally raising interest rates? So how does that all fit together, Adam?
Yeah, to think of this as a housing bubble in the conventional sense rather understates the drama of what we're talking about. I mean, China's housing bubble is a synonym for the most dramatic process of urbanization that our species has ever witnessed. So China went from being a huge country with 1 billion people in 1980, of which 20% lived in urban areas, slightly less than 20%, to being the even bigger society we know today with 1.4 billion people 40 years later, of which 65% live in urban areas. So an epic number. Hundreds of millions of Chinese people moved from the countryside to cities, gigantic cities of tens of millions of people, but also a whole array of what by any standards of the world are very, very large cities and medium-sized towns across this giant country. And that's what is the making of the Chinese bubble. To call it a bubble just sort of understates the drama. I mean, China didn't have a private property system until the late 1990s, and in the space of a single generation, it's created a flywheel of wealth generation, the likes of which we've never seen before. And that's the China bubble. This isn't like a bunch of mansions in Florida or something. This is a radical transformation of a large part of the earth. It literally involved digging out vast quantities of iron ore, making vast quantities of cement. I mean, China's thought to have poured more cement in 3 years in the 2010s than the United States in the entire 20th century. So we're talking about convulsive change. This is the Anthropocene, like a physical transformation of the world on a gigantic scale in a very short period of time. And yes, that does then generate around the edges some kind of frothiness, in the financial system. Unsurprisingly, quite a lot of money gets made and lost in the process of doing this. And the Chinese have decided to prick this bubble, which itself is remarkable. And now they are dealing with the fallout as the bubble deflates and deflates dramatically. And yeah, they're trying to lower interest rates, which is the kind of conventional monetary policy tool faced with a crisis like this. You try and make credit easier. This is indeed counter to what every other central bank in the world is doing right now, which is to try and counter inflation, which is not a problem in China, with higher interest rates. And that creates tension where it creates tension on the balance of payments in the foreign account, because Chinese assets become less attractive as the interest rates go down relative to assets in the rest of the world, which become more attractive as interest rates go up. And so the risk is that you have, tension on the foreign account, that you could have capital flight even. And this isn't a pure hypothetical. In 2015, 2016, the last time the Chinese economy was in real trouble, there was very substantial capital flight. And that would really be worrying for Beijing. But the response to the crisis in 2015, 2016 was that Beijing intensified its controls. And so right now, though foreign investors are pulling back from China, we haven't seen anything like that kind of capital flight. I think the bigger concern is actually domestic, which is that whether the Chinese will be able to carry through, if you like, the purging of the real estate market that will be necessary to restore something like stability. Because they may, in a sense, flinch. They may not really be able to carry through the kind of weeding out of this overexpanded sector that would be necessary to really restore the basis for healthy growth. And that's, I think, the bigger concern about the interest rate cuts. On the other hand, not doing anything, faced with the collapse in this market, would be very risky.
So it seems the other big factor that is playing a role here is the coronavirus pandemic, and to some extent, we in the West have stopped talking about this so much. But I'm curious what role the pandemic is still playing in hindering the Chinese economy.
It's pivotal to the entire story of 2022 in China, because China roared into the year with relatively rapid growth. So rapid, in fact, in 2021 that it stretched its electricity system, its energy system. The beginning of the energy price surge that has now hit the entire world economy was in China in 2021 as a result of the speed of the Chinese recovery. But crucially, the regime lagged in ensuring the vaccination, the triple vaccination using Chinese vaccines of the elderly and most vulnerable parts of the Chinese population. And so when the latest series of variants, highly infectious variants of COVID spread from the outside world to China earlier this year, Beijing faces an appalling dilemma. Because to maintain their zero COVID policy, they don't really have much option but to lock cities down. because the vaccination rate for the vulnerable is still too low. And so starting, most dramatically in Shanghai in the spring, they have been in the business of imposing really comprehensive, absolutely crippling lockdowns on giant conurbations. I mean, this is so much more dramatic than anything we saw, maybe outside Latin America, and certainly nowhere in Western Europe or the United States experienced anything like what the Chinese have been going through. That cripples growth. It interrupts supply chains, and this is crucial given the real estate situation, massively damages confidence.
I wonder whether, provisionally, obviously, at least, we could offer some overall assessment of Xi's economic leadership. So at least thus far in his tenure. I mean, how would you characterize his economic vision, and how would you assess how he's been as an economic leader overall?
Well, I think the zero COVID policy is the one area where you could say that under his leadership, the regime has really made a false step, a false move with absolutely disastrous consequences. I mean, in the area of domestic policy, many people, I think, will fault the aggression of his foreign policy and the implications that's had for China's position in the world. But on the domestic front, the central issue will be this, decision to dig in on zero COVID, the failure to roll out the vaccines, and the impasse, the dead end that this has created in 2022 and ongoing into 2023 for the Chinese economy. A first best solution, which was the Chinese hardline approach in 2020, has flipped into being a real disaster in 2022. And he will forever be remembered, presumably, as the man who really presided over this and identified himself with it. In broader terms, I think his legacy is really mixed. He again and again, whether you look at the area of corruption or the role of state-owned enterprises or indeed foreign policy, there's this sort of ambiguity to his position. I mean, and it goes all the way back to the beginning, because it's worth remembering that when he came in 2012, he was widely thought of as a reforming pro-market force. And there has been reform of a kind. So, corruption was a real issue and the regime has really cracked down on it. But the way in which it's cracked down on it has been part of a power grab by Xi and his immediate circle. Or likewise with the state-owned enterprises. I mean, they have, in fact, become much more efficient and much more streamlined. But as a way, if you like, of permanently consolidating their position within the economy. So I think one way of thinking about what she's doing is a kind of conservative consolidation of the CCP's power in the sphere of the economy. The party is now everywhere in the Chinese economy, even in the private sector. So it isn't just simply that the state-owned enterprises have consolidated their position, but the party, which of course sits across the boundary line between the state and society in China, is now also operating in hedge funds in China, in every tech business in China. So again, a kind of a blend of, if you like, enlightened self-interest or enlightened authoritarian self-interest, all alongside the notorious, crackdown on Hong Kong, which is causing huge problems for China's relations with the West, and the even more brutal lockdown in Xinjiang, and the upholding of claims to Taiwan, which have raised the tension. So a very complex picture in which the assertion of authoritarian power on behalf of the party is, as it were, the organizing idea, but with ambiguous economic effects.
Okay, so it sounds like the authoritarianism is what is consistent here, whether it's instrumental or not, and to what ends remains to be seen. I guess finally, I wanted to ask, just generally, whether China could be said to be caught in some version of what's called a middle income trap. I guess the idea being here that, plenty of countries have found it, relatively, I wouldn't say easy, but doable to go from being a sort of low income country to a middle income country. But the real challenge that where a lot of countries end up stalling is precisely going from a middle income country to a high income country. I mean, is that China's experience right now? Does this sort of conform with a development pattern we've seen in other countries?
Well, China is a high middle income country, and its growth model does seem to have reached something of a dead end. So it's kind of tempting, I think, to conclude that, it's in the middle income trap. It's middle income and it's in the trap. And that would, not just be, I think, tempting as a conclusion, but also comforting for Western analysts, because it would mean, in a sense, that we would predict that the Chinese challenge to Western power and influence would be in the process of grinding to a halt. So I think it would be convenient. And so my first reaction is really to suggest that we check our prejudices here. because this is just a little bit too convenient a story. And the most basic question is perhaps what persuades us that the experience of a cluster of medium-sized middle-income countries really extrapolates to the experience of this giant social experiment that is economic growth under capitalism, under the command of the CCP. I mean, is this really an analogous experience? Why would we think that this is like the experience of a Turkey or a Thailand, or an Indonesia or a Mexico? Like, why would we imagine that the rules that apply to them apply to China when China has defied so many other rules of economic development? You know, if it's true that Western social science extends to China, it would be a surprise to my mind, rather than assuming that it's true. If you actually look at the problems that we think that China has, they're actually closer to those that Japan had in the 1990s, and Japan by that point was not a middle-income country. So China may be suffering, if you like, at middle-income levels from rich country problems. That might, as it were, get closer to the truth if you think about the real estate issue. And then the question is, can China find a way out of this? Are there new policies that it could adopt? And given its current position, there are huge numbers of avenues for further growth. The most obvious is the labor force, and there are hundreds of millions of Chinese still at relatively rudimentary levels of education. At the same time as we know that China is the world's leading producer of world-class STEM postgraduates. So that gap within China itself tells you how much opportunity there could be for growth. People will then say, oh, well, China's an aging population. But we all know what the answer to an aging population is: good healthcare and longer working lives. So that doesn't by itself have to be an absolute parameter that constrains Chinese growth. In areas like technology, for instance, China is a world leader, embattled, of course, because of the tech sanctions now being imposed, and limited because, you know, developing ultra high tech is extremely demanding field, but nevertheless present. And then if you look at something like, you know, the green energy transition, China is not just a leader, it's absolutely the dominant force in the entire sector worldwide. So if the energy transition's for real, China's way ahead of everyone else. Now, this isn't to say, okay, fine, it's, you know, a gimme. Like it's quite clear that Chinese growth doesn't face any, you know, it's going to take off and going to resume. I think that's actually quite unlikely. But on the other hand, these are all reasons for doubting that China's future is well predicted by the experience of a Mexico or a Turkey or a Thailand, for instance.
Got it. That's a genuinely useful message, I think, especially for me as an American, so used to sort of, just growing up in the context of American exceptionalism, you know, America having this singular messianic mission. You know, there are other countries that are exceptional in their own terms. In any case, this is why a Chinese recession is not just another recession. So in any case, we will leave it there for now, but we'll be right back. So the next data point is $84.1 billion. That is the estimated total economic activity across the United States produced solely by the sport of golf. That's according to a study commissioned by the World Golf Foundation. So maybe take that with a grain of salt. In any case, the findings also say there's a 22% increase in economic activity related to golf since 2011. By all accounts, golf picked up in popularity during the pandemic when it was considered a safe recreational activity, you know, social distancing, outdoors, etc. But in any case, golf is also a sport that's always been associated with business dealings of various kinds. And so, we thought we'd look at the economics of golf in general. Before I get to the proper questions, I thought I'd just ask you, Adam, whether you play golf. I realize I don't know that. I've never played golf personally, but how about you?
No, I'm in the same boat. I've never played golf either.
Okay.
I find it kind of therapeutic to watch on TV sometimes.
I could imagine that, except I literally don't know what's going on. Like, I don't know.
Basic idea, hit ball several times till it goes in a hole.
They get it into the ball, but maybe that's why. I mean, I just found it terribly boring to watch because I couldn't understand the mechanics. Like, I couldn't understand what it meant to be playing well or not, having never played it myself. So just
mini golf is like a painless introduction. You should go try it. You should join mini golf somewhere.
That much, yes, that much I've played. But the connection between mini golf and regular golf, I leave to others to analyze. But okay, anyway, to get into the economics part of this. Yeah, I mean, clearly golf is firmly established in the United States, but also the United Kingdom, where golf was invented as a sport. But how about beyond that? I mean, has golf become a global sport? And if it has, I mean, can we tell whether that expansion is a response to demand from Western tourists and business travelers, or if it's a kind of more of a locally driven phenomenon?
Well, it may have started out in the sort of the wider cultural ambit of the British Empire, but golf now is emphatically a global sport, hugely present in East Asia. So the top 5 world golf markets are the United States in number 1, Japan number 2, South Korea number 3, Canada number 4, UK only in number 5. So the golf, industry estimates that about 67 million people play golf around the world, which I think on the back of an envelope is, just short of 1% of the world's population. And of that 67 million, about 30 million are in North America, US and Canada. About 10 million are in Europe, of which half is in the UK, Great Britain and Ireland, in fact. And the rest is Asia. So it's really Japan, South Korea, which are the hugest markets. Koreans golfers spend more per capita on their golf equipment than anyone else in the world, and they're really gigantic.
Interesting. So I'm curious if you could tell us how golf earns its reputation for being, an activity where business deals are struck. Is there really something to that data that would support that reputation? And if so, what accounts for this kind of affinity between golf and business? And I guess, business-related crimes, insider trading, et cetera, I've also seen as also occurring on the golf course.
I think there absolutely is this association, and it's to do with the fact that golf was, for most of its history, a rich man's game. And both those phrases deliberately. So as it spread around the Anglosphere in the late 19th century, it was above all a bourgeois sport, with some aristocratic involvement, of course. Landowners contributed because space is at a premium. But above all, it was also a masculine thing. And down to this day, there are about a dozen clubs in the United States which are male only. And I think that kind of clubbishness, the creation of a intensely confined inside a network of affluent men who then spend hours and hours and hours, following these balls around these beautifully manicured lawns. And the amount of time you actually spend hitting a ball is tiny by the comparison with the amount of time you spend wandering around. And with every opportunity to talk, has turned it into a privileged, meeting ground for the business elite. And there are numerous well-documented cases of insider trading. I mean, literally, shares changing hands in remarkably conspicuous fashions shortly after, significant executives from different companies or investors met on the golf course. And like the dark horse of golf, Phil Mickelson, was involved in 2012 in a rather famous incident using the lawns as an occasion just for private, discreet meeting. So
it's just as simple as rich people being together for a long time.
Rich men.
Eventually they get around. Rich men. Yeah.
Rich men in the end get around to no good. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Give them long enough.
And they're outdoors. There's nothing else to do. And eventually you get to crime. That's just what happens.
Well, insider trading is it's such a weird crime. It's basically just, gossiping.
Yeah. Gossiping. Yeah.
It's such a fine line between insider trading and just what everyone does in business all the time. So I think, it's rather the other way around. People were doing what, business people do. And then a bunch of pesky laws came along and made it all wrong and, criminal.
There you go. Sounds like a reason to ban golf entirely. It's just sort of unreformable. But another thing that's been in the news is that Saudi Arabia is now in the midst of trying to establish a professional golf tour to rival the PGA that goes by the name of LIV, the LIV Golf Tour. That's a Roman numeral, actually. So it would be 54, which I guess is something about scoring par on every hole, et cetera, or something. But as a result of this, the PGA, the existing golf tour, is sort of barring its professional members, the professional golf players, from participating in the Saudi Golf Tour. And this just got me wondering, how did the PGA sort of become this kind of de facto monopoly that can bar its players from playing elsewhere? And why are so many U.S. professional sports leagues organized in this kind of de facto monopoly cartel system way in the first place? I mean, why is sort of the government allow sports to get organized this way, Adam?
Yeah, this Saudi venture is quite fascinating. Introduced me to the new concept of sports washing. Not like greenwashing, but sports washing. So like the somewhat tattered brand of the kingdom associates itself with a global sport. I mean, they do it in all sorts of areas, right? With Aramco backing Formula One and so on. So it's a not altogether surprising venture by the Saudis. It's a great question though. This idea of sports leagues and as essentially quasi-monopolistic organizations. And the logic here is really quite subtle and interesting, which is that to ensure, good competition, close competition, you have, in a sense, to manage the league as something other than a commercial free-for-all. You have to be willing, for instance, to impose salary caps, which ultimately constrain what everyone in the league can earn. You have to be willing to manage the flow of new recruits to teams so as to level the playing field. All of this, frankly, to a European mind, if you come from the world of European soccer, which is much closer to a fully capitalist free-for-all, where wealth just simply buys the biggest players at whatever price they command. And as a result, you get these dynasties established which dominate sports over decades. In the US model, you have this much more manicured vision of competition, which, however, depends on rigorously policing the boundaries of the league, as you say, defining a kind of monopolistic control over who gets to compete and on what terms in a given sport. And they do this for the sake of the spectators, right? Because the entire thing is then much more entertaining because you never know exactly who's going to be on top and you're constantly rigging the market. In this particular case, yes, some of the players that took part in the Saudi venture sued the PGA, and then in fact LIV, the Saudi venture, has also joined this case. So far, I think very few legal analysts think that they're going to make much headway against the PGA because, again, in American law, there's a distinction, and it's quite a subtle one, between the PGA legitimately defending its commercial interests against the competitor and the PGA in foul ways, in illegitimate ways, as it were, undermining their capacity to compete at all and inflicting deliberate harm on them. And one of the points that the PGA's lawyers have made is like, where is the harm to the players that have enrolled in the Saudi league if the Saudi league is forced by the PGA's resistance to pay them more? I mean, because these are highly valued players who were previously prominent in the PGA, and have to lure them out. Of course, the Saudis have had to offer them a golden purse. And now those players also want to be able to compete in the PGA, right? And the court said, hang on, you can choose between the two and you can benefit from the competitive situation created by the PGA's resistance on the Saudi side. But you can't, as it were, both have your cake and eat it.
Fascinating. Obviously, another remarkable thing about the sport of golf is just the enormous golf courses where the sport needs to be played. And got me wondering about how those golf courses get established in the first place, because it seems to me these days like land is something that is generally seems scarce in the West these days. It's, you constantly hear about fights over land usage. So I don't know, how do golf course developers raise the money for new courses, and how do they acquire this land, or is there kind of like backdoor deals involved in getting these courses established in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, as we know from Trump's struggles in Scotland and Ireland, this is a hugely political issue. The average golf course takes about, it's a substantial piece of real estate, 50 to 70 hectares, so that's 120 to 180 acres per course. So these are pretty substantial, and there's 38,000 of them worldwide. So in the United States alone, it's estimated that golf courses take up a territory the size of Delaware and Rhode Island put together. So, there could be a state of golf in the US Congress. In fact, you can quite rapidly set this up, I think, with many existing members of that illustrious house. I mean, and it's a remarkable global development. It's really driven in the first instance by suburban wealth, and that's really the dominating force in the history of golf courses. And it's a commercial business, right? It's club formation, members subscribe, you buy up the lands. You can buy up all sorts of different types of land. There's quite a lot of courses in the United States built on landfills to just reuse land. But by far and away, the most dramatic development it was in Asia from the 60s onwards, and most dramatically of all in Japan during the boom period of the 70s, 80s, and then into the early 90s when it all imploded. And in Japan, golf course memberships were trading. There was a bourse, there was an exchange for golf club memberships where people would bid over $2 million for the most exclusive memberships in Tokyo clubs. And it all came crashing down in the 1990s. And then, astonishingly, large-scale global investors, including Goldman Sachs, got into the business of buying up bankrupt Japanese golf clubs and assembled entire portfolios of, if you like, subprime Japanese golf clubs, and then marketed those. So that was, the kind of the final stage, if you like, of the financialization of golf. It was moving from elite social status and the sort of suburbanization as this mass phenomenon to the creation of these baubles that golf club memberships were in Japan in the 80s, to then the remetabolization of those assets as the underpinnings for securities, essentially, in the 90s and early 2000s, from which then Goldman Sachs and everyone else could exit as you then handed these assets off to other investors.
Got it. I guess finally, I mean, you're mentioning just how vast these courses are. I wonder how much money goes into maintaining these golf courses. And yeah, just from a business model perspective, is that money well spent? Does the kind of money on maintenance actually pay off in terms of the revenues that these courses generate?
The costs are not as huge as I anticipated, actually. I mean, apparently, I've looked at quite a lot of studies of golf course management over the last day or two. And broadly speaking, for a substantial modern private golf course, the maintenance of the grounds is, between $1 and $3 million, maybe, depending on what kind of class of course you're talking about. You're spending per club member maybe in the order of a couple of thousand, maybe as much as $3,000, which then, if you average this over a reasonably busy golf club, means that the average round of golf is probably requiring the spending of about $50 to $60 in grounds maintenance. So those are the kind of, figures. So it's like one round of golf is the equivalent of 3 hours of reasonably well-paid yard work, basically. If you think of yard work being paid at about $20 an hour. So that would be the rough trade-off. Some, relatively affluent person pays somebody else to mow the lawn for 3 hours so as they can, enjoy their round of golf.
That was a lot of economics of golf all at once, but there's a lot to that topic. Hopefully people enjoyed it, and unfortunately we have to leave it there for now. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's at Ones and Tooze Pod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.